Well, hello everyone. I'm here today to talk with you about progress in climate change adaptation planning based on our research in the United States and in France, specifically focused on small and mid-sized cities during the past 10 years, roughly embracing the period between 2007 and 2017. We started this research at the University of Versailles, and I would like to acknowledge my co-author, Charlotte Dacunho, who is a professor at UVSQ. So you can find more information about our research in our recent paper published in Urban Climate, which is titled Local Climate Change Adaptation Plans in the United States and France, Comparison and Lessons Learned in 2007-2017. And this paper is also available for your review on the Blackboard, so I hope that you would read it in conjunction to listening to my lecture. So here is a brief outline of what we are going to talk today. I will focus first of all on the significance of the study and its historical background. What do we know from the history about climate adaptation planning? Why is this important? And because this is a pilot study, I would primarily speak today about our methodology, about the framework of comparative assessment indicators that we have developed specifically for small and mid-sized cities, which is based on 25 different quality criteria that we grouped in 3 clusters, and all these criteria are derived from the scholarly literature and a variety of guidelines of various organizations. As I mentioned already, we focus here on small and mid-sized cities. We are focusing specifically on France and the United States because they exemplify very different climate planning philosophies and very different approach to planning in general. And our case study consists of 20 cities in the United States and 18 case studies in France. And then I will discuss our results, conclusions, and recommendations. And of course, I welcome your questions at the end through the Blackboard. So as many of you, I'm sure, are aware, the majority of the population of the world today lives in cities. And the urban population of the world is now about 55%, and it is expected to become 66% by the middle of the century. And if you think about the areas represented in this study, the developed countries such as France and the United States, the percentage of urban population is even higher. 75% of Europeans and 82% of Americans lived in urban areas based on census data in 2016. So urban areas account today for 60 to 80% of the world's energy consumption. They also generate over 70% of the human greenhouse gas emissions. So cities, on one hand, are among the most vulnerable places to climate change because of their very high density of the population and very complex infrastructure. But at the same time, cities are also the key actors in finding solutions for climate change. So this is why thinking about how cities can adapt to climate change is really extremely important. It's needless to say that there is a variety of data that clearly indicates that during the past 100 years, and especially during the past 30, 40 years, we have been experiencing unprecedented climate change, and there is absolutely no doubt today that this climate change is primarily caused by human activities. So here you see temperature data from several data sets from NASA, from Hadley Center in UK, from Japanese Meteorological Agency, from NOAA, and they all show extremely good agreement about how temperature has progressed during the past temperature. Our future is uncertain, not because we don't know what is causing climate change. We know very well that climate change is caused by human activities. What we really don't know what will be the climate policies and how quickly we can transition to decarbonization of our economy. And this is why there is a very wide range of scenarios, from very moderate scenarios such as RCP 2.6 to extreme scenarios such as RCP 8.5, and unfortunately I have to say that right now as a world we are more on track to RCP 8.5. For those of you who don't remember from GPY412, I just want to remind that RCP stands for Representative Concentration Pathways, and those policy scenarios that are developed as very broad storylines. They are developed by a number of institutions around the world under umbrella of the IPCC. And so what RCPs tell us is how quickly we can put some measures to control and mitigate climate change if we adopt various policies. And so what we see here is unprecedented growth, unprecedented warming under RCP 8.5 by the end of the century that really could be curbed down if we could adopt much more drastic climate mitigation policies and going away from fossil fuels and transitional to renewable energy under RCP 2.6. And then, of course, there is a variety of other scenarios, and they're sort of in between and showing stabilization of warming under different scenarios. However, today I really want to focus much more on climate change adaptation rather than climate change mitigation. So here are two futures of the world, right? This is what we see if we compare the difference of RCP 2.6, very moderate warming with sea level rise, also fairly moderate under 2 degrees centigrade with RCP 2.6, and much more drastic scenario with much stronger warming and much higher sea level rise under RCP 8.5. So what are the solutions? What we can do? What we can do in the interim, facing this uncertainty, as we are not sure, at the local level, it's very difficult for the city to predict what to do and how to prepare to one or another scenario. So although we all want to mitigate climate change, we want to put in place better policies for the world, we want to hope that climate mitigation measures would go forward, but at the same time, it is very responsible and it's necessary to adapt at the local and at the national and at the global scale and even at the individual scale for a variety of scenarios, including the worst case scenario. And of course, our experience right now, I am lecturing you from my backyard because we cannot meet on campus. We're in the middle of the global pandemic due to COVID-19. And this can be used in many ways as an example of where unpreparedness can bring us if we don't have climate adaptation plan, if we don't have an adaptation plan, if we don't have an action plan. So let's talk about climate change mitigation versus adaptation. So I want to remind that mitigation are those measures that we put in place in order to reduce the sources of greenhouse gases and increase their sinks. For example, planting trees is a measure of climate change mitigation, or reducing emissions by reducing the use of fossil fuels, or changing our transportation and providing more public transportation options. Those are climate mitigation options. Adaptation, on the other hand, is an adjustment which is focusing on response to expected climate change and the effects of climate change to moderate the harm and to also to exploit the beneficial opportunities. So what can we do in terms of adaptations? Yes, we can also plant trees in order to manage our stormwater. We can provide more shade in our cities. We can use a variety of ecosystem services by use of green and blue infrastructure. There is a number of adaptation and mitigation measures where we can actually use the same measure. As I just mentioned, use of vegetation, use of ecosystem services is a prime example of measures that we can use both as mitigation and adaptation to climate change. So here are a few important historical milestones of cities' climate planning. It really starts in 1993 when the International Council on Local Environmental Initiatives started a program, Cities for Climate Protection Program, and we would see in this study a couple of plans that were the first pilot projects of this program. And in 2005, C40, which is the consortium of the largest cities such as Paris and New York and London and many other mega cities, came together to coordinate their action on climate action. The Sierra Club launched the same year Cool Cities campaign, and then the US Conference of Mayors started a climate protection agreement, encouraging mayors around the United States to take action on climate change in the absence of the action of the federal government. 2007 was also very important when the ICLEI USA launched its new program, Climate Resilient Communities. And again, in the studies, we will see a few examples of plans that were inspired by this program and supported by ICLEI. The same year, the Covenant of Mayors launched Mayors Adapt. And then in the European Union, a very important legislation was adapted, adapting to climate change in Europe, bringing together all members of the European Union together under the agenda of climate change adaptation. In 2009, the European Union also adopted Adapting to Climate Change towards a European Framework for Action. And then in 2013, the Rockefeller Foundation in the United States started 100 Resilient Cities. In 2017, Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy came together, bringing together mayors of the European Union, mayors of Europe, and mayors of North America together as a compact and opening the membership essentially to mayors of all cities around the world. So in the study, our first very difficult task was to understand what are the guidelines, what the local governments, what cities and counties in different countries can do, how they can be informed to prepare their own climate adaptation plans. There is lots of literature, and this literature is in different languages and somewhat fragmented, and there are different organizations and different international entities and different national agencies who give advice on how the climate adaptation plan should look. What are the major criteria? And so my co-author and I, being bilingual, reading both in French and in English, decided we are going to screen all the literature available in English and in French to see what are those advices and how coherent and how well coordinated all this literature. So it was a major undertaking of more than a semester. So we just decided to dive in the national and international scholarly bibliography, technical notes, white papers, gray literature, and we put together this database, essentially summarizing all the guidelines from various institutions, national, international, think tanks, and so on and so forth. What we found from this preliminary analysis of the bilingual literature, that there are many common attributes of successful climate adaptation. So seems to be pretty obvious that if we want to write a good climate adaptation plan, this plan should have clear goal setting, should be pretty clear, driven by specific, achievable, result-oriented, time-bound objectives. These objectives should be measurable, they should be context-specific, they should be based on the context-specific assessment of vulnerability and risks. This analysis should be informed by the best available science. It also should rely on political will and support of diverse stakeholders, including civil society. The plan really should reflect coordination and balance with climate change mitigation. We cannot focus just on adaptation as something standalone. The climate adaptation plan should be coordinated with climate mitigation measures, disaster management measures, emergency management, sustainability planning, environmental planning, master planning, urban planning, transportation planning. So it really needs to be integrated with everything else that the city is doing. We also found that in order to be successful, climate adaptation planning really must be flexible, and it should show its ability to cope with uncertainty and complexity of climate and climatic but also non-climatic changes. Cities face many challenges, not only climate change. They might also face issues such as unemployment and displacement of various industries and a variety of different issues. They might deal with immigration issues. They might deal with health crisis and so on and so forth. And so climate adaptation needs to be adaptable, and it needs to take into account of all these other factors besides climate change. We also found from the literature that climate adaptation plan to be successful really should be integrated across multiple sectors of economy and also multiple scale. Again, city is not standing alone. It's a part of state or a county or a borough, and then a state, of course, in the United States, and then a state as a part of the federal entity. In France, those are different subdivisions. We need to see what's going on at the level of department, what's going on at the level of the region, and so on. So all these actions need to be integrated in a broader geographic sense. And then we also came to the realization that climate adaptation plans are really living documents. So adaptation measures and climate action measures, they need to be continuously monitored and reassessed, and we need to change our decisions based on our progress. So it's sort of the iterative process that is growing as we are implementing climate adaptation plan. Based on the literature, we have developed this fairly simple climate adaptation plan assessment framework. So this framework consists of 25 indicators. They're all quantitative, and we roughly group them into 3 groups based on the type of criteria used in this assessment. So the first group is really focusing on the structure and organization of each climate adaptation plan. Things such as logical structure and flow and readability and clarity. Does the plan does it have time-bound and achievable objectives? Does it have a budget? Does it have implementation plan? Does it have any evaluation plan? Does it use measurable indicators and so on? The second group is focusing on the quality of the content, and primarily it focuses on the scientific basis for climate adaptation planning. What kind of data, what kind of methods, what methodology was used in order to develop climate adaptation plan? Is it informed by climate change impact analysis? Is this analysis based on climate change trends and climate change scenarios? Is this plan based on human vulnerability assessment and how this assessment was conducted? Does it take into account uncertainties? Does it take into account future risks and opportunities? How flexible it is? Is it place-based? And so on and so forth. So you will find in the article and in the PowerPoint attached on this full list of indicators. And then finally, the third group was focusing on the process of the plan development and inclusivity of different stakeholders. So we're very interested to see who was developing the plan, whose voices were reflected in the climate adaptation process, how this conversation about climate adaptation at the city level was integrated in the broader context at the state level or at the department level, at the regional level, and how much this plan was aware of other adaptation plans and other best practices, either from the literature or from other measures in the same country or anywhere worldwide, and how well this plan was integrated with other measures, including mitigation measures, disaster management planning, and so on. Again, you'll find the full list of indicators in the paper and in the PowerPoint attached if you cannot see all of them right now on the screen. So we have developed a database that would serve as a platform for continuous research. So right now we have a fairly small number of plants in the database, but this database will continue to grow based not only on the research in the United States and in France, but also in other countries. And so the database essentially consists of the metadata cards for each city, for each climate adaptation plan, providing information about the city and the plan itself. So here you see an example of climate resiliency plan for the city of Grand Rapids, and you have here information for Grand Rapids. You have here information about the climate resiliency report, and essentially you have some summary information about all these criteria in each of these three groups. You have information about the structure, about the quality of the content and scientific basis, and then you have the quality about plant development. And then from there, you can go in the database and you can explore within each of these criteria the quantitative data and the ranking, and then you can also go to the original plan, and you can see if there were any other further iterations, if this is the first plan or maybe something else is going on after that. So for example, in case of Grand Rapids, many of you are familiar with this plan. So essentially this is not a plan, it's the report. It's a climate resiliency report, but has a very strong focus on climate adaptation. That's why we included it. And we also included it because I'm very familiar with this plan. I was working with WIMIAC and the city of Grand Rapids developing climate change scenarios and helping with vulnerability assessment to the city. So this plan was published in 2013, and right now this is the latest data that we have on the state of adaptation in the city of Grand Rapids. And some of you probably also well aware that starting with past August, with August 2020, August 2019, the city has been working on the new climate adaptation plan. So it's going to be very specific climate adaptation plan, not climate resiliency plan, and it's going to have much more specific measurable criteria. It would also have much stronger component on social justice and environmental justice in connection to climate adaptation. But right now, this is the latest that we have for the city of Grand Rapids. So for each city in France and in the United States that was a part of the study, we have a similar metadata, and the city can use, the local governments can use them as a departure point then for adding more information and also sharing experience. So really the goal of the database is to help the cities what's going on in other cities of comparable size, or comparable economic outlook, or comparable climatic conditions, similar climate impacts, what they can use in terms of sharing experience and tapping into experience of other cities. The assessment of climate adaptation plans was based on the scale from 0 to 4. So for each criteria, for each of these 25 criteria, we used the ranking from 0 to 4, with 0 not addressed at all, 1 briefly mentioned only, 2 present but not explained, 3 clearly explained, and finally 4 was fully explained in detail and illustrated with examples. And then for the cumulative scores that were aggregated from all these 25 criteria, essentially we used the same scale from 0 to 4, where 0 to 1 was poor, and 1 to 2 was fair, 2 to 3 was good, 3 to 4 was very good, and 4 was excellent. Now, given all this, there's obviously some shortcoming here. You probably already noticed this, or at least I want to encourage you to think about limitations of our approach. Of course, these criteria are not weighted, so this method really makes an assumption that each of these criteria has equal importance. For example, clarity of the plans is really evaluated in the same way as, let's say, coordination of adaptation with emergency measurement. So this is a major flaw of our study as I see it. think in future we would develop more sophisticated tool. We would like to put weights, and we would like to do multi-criteria evaluation and multi-objective evaluation using GIS in order to kind of put different weights as we build more and more data to see, like what is more important in this assessment and what is less important, and or for more sophisticated scale, perhaps in future that will be not scale from 0 to 4, but 0 to 10, depending on how much the scale can help us with differentiation of different approaches. This is a pilot, so this is a fairly rough assessment, on a very simple scale from 0 to 4. As we assessed all these plans, and so I also wanted to say that there were just two authors. It's my co-author Charlotte Dacunha and I. Essentially, what we did, we read each plan separately, we ranked them separately based on each criteria. Then we compared our scores, then we had a discussion, we reconciled all the differences, had another discussion to make sure that everything is reconciled, not quantitatively, but really qualitatively, to make sure that we compare our opinions. And then, we finally conducted our final evaluation, and then we ran statistical analysis to see where all the cities fall in each group. So what you see here is the distribution of the assessment results in Group 1, Group 2, and Group 3 for all plans, and then for the climate adaptation plans in France, and then climate adaptation plans in the United States. If you look at the distribution of this data in the graph, what we see that in the Group 1, for example, if you take a look at criteria such as clarity and goal setting and implementation plannings, all plans seem to do quite well. They don't do very well. They don't do well at all in terms of budget planning. We see that the majority of plans, both in the US and in France, really don't have very good idea of what kind of budget, what kind of funding would be needed in order to implement climate adaptation. And we also found that both in France and the United States, cities don't really have very clear vision of how they would evaluate success of those adaptation plans. We also found that, especially in the United States, cities don't use enough measurement performance indicators. French plans seem to do a little bit better job, but again, measurable performance indicators are not used enough. If we look at the second group, if we look at the scientific data, here we have scientific content. Here we see very significant variability in terms of the quality of climate adaptation plans based on different criteria. So again, we see some similarities between France and the United States. We see that overall plans are doing pretty well in terms of being informed by climate impact analysis and vulnerability analysis. They do use climate data. On the other hand, we see that both in France and the United States, there's very limited attention to analysis of uncertainty and current and future risks, and very limited attention also to consideration of social justice. This is something that we found the major weakness. When it comes to the process of climate adaptation and engagement of stakeholders, we saw that in general, French cities did much better job in terms of implementation of participatory process and engagement of various stakeholders, especially engagement of the local businesses, local companies. But overall, we saw again that there are some significant similarities between what's going on the both sides of the Atlantic. This triangular graph that you see on the bottom of the graph can actually tell you a little bit more about what are the strengths of the US plans and what are the strengths of French plans. So we see that French plans are doing better in the Group 1, the overall organization of the plan, the structure, different elements of the plan, and then they also do better in terms of engagement of different stakeholders. And then the US plans overall do better when it comes to the content and particularly scientific base for climate adaptation planning. Let's take a look at each group. So here you see the strengths and weaknesses of climate adaptation planning in each of these three groups. In group 1, structure and organization, we clearly see that on average, French plans did much better in terms of the inclusion of measurable performance indicators. And this is in many ways is just related to French planning culture, urban planning culture, and regional planning culture, which is significantly more data-driven compared to a variety of different approaches in different states in the United States. If we look at the group 2, this is the largest group in terms of the number of criteria where we're using data on the content and scientific basis for adaptation planning. We see clearly that US plans did a much better job, significantly better job in terms of analysis of climate trends and scenarios. They're more informed by climate change impact analysis. They're more informed by analysis of vulnerabilities. And then French plans do a little bit better job in terms of being more place-based, and they're also more integrated across multiple societal sectors. They're also more integrated across multiple geographic scales. And then what is perhaps quite concerning is that we see all plans pay really low attention to social equity and justice, and so we will talk more about it later. We also found that plans give very little attention to participatory science, and this is particularly the case of French plans, but even in the US plans we see very limited inclusion of citizen science, participatory science. It looks like missed opportunity for sure. And then if we look at the third group, we see in terms of the plan development process and inclusivity and coordination, they see that on average, around almost in all criteria, French plans are performing better than the US plans. And this might have something to do, as we are looking at the data, we interpret it in the context of the culture of planning in different states in the US and the national planning culture in France, and we see that French plans follow much more uniform methodology. It's a national methodology that is mandated for local governments, while in the US it's a much more bottom-up approach, and so different cities and sometimes different cities themselves use different approaches, and so it's much less comparable when it comes to coordination, and it's also more difficult to coordinate because the US plans use so many different approaches. So if we look at the summary of all the plans and see how the cities did overall, the results are not very reassuring. So we found that 7 French and 2 US plans have received a total score over 3. So that means that they're good or excellent. 3 means good. And however, if we look at the distribution of cumulative scores in each of this group, there is quite lots of variability of ranking with respect to each group and each criteria, and so 5 of these French plans have a score 3, which means good, on 2 groups, at least 2 groups of criteria, and then only 2 US and 2 French plans actually received good or higher than good in all 3 groups. So some plans can be good at planning, for example, planning process, but not so good at content. And some of them, might perform quite well in content, but they really don't have logical structure, and they miss some important components. So we found only 2 out of all these plans that we have analyzed. Out of 28 plans, we found only 4 plans, 2 in the US and 2 in France, that were really good in all these 3 criteria. So I want to invite you to look with me and explore a little bit more this experience of 4 cities, 2 in the US and 2 in France, who actually did well in all these 3 groups of criteria. So these 4 cities are Grand Nancy and Saint-Étienne in France, and then Punta Gorda, Florida, and Laguna Woods, California in the United States. So we wanted to kind of interpret this data and see what these cities are doing differently from all other cities in our sample, and what are the key characteristics that have contributed into the best practices of climate adaptation planning. What we found common about all the cities, that all the climate adaptation plans were initiated by the cities themselves. Some plans we saw were initiated by external groups, maybe they were proposed by academic partners, or they were top down by various organizations, maybe they were a result of grant received by neighboring university and so on. So in case of these 4 cities, the initiative came from the cities themselves and not from their partners. They were also funded primarily by the cities themselves. Again, they were not funded by some external grant from a big university around, or some industrial partner. They came from the cities and they were funded by the cities. We also found that all these 4 communities have a very long history of local environmental and climate change related initiatives. They have engaged population who is passionate about environment, and all these 4 cities have very high level of community engagement and community awareness about social issues and environmental issues. We also found that in all these 4 cases, there was strong evidence of collaboration of the cities with their local academic institutions. And finally, we also noticed that all these 4 cities were located in areas with broader climate planning initiative. So, they were part of either a region or a state where some other initiatives related to climate change are already happening. Laguna Woods is a part of California, and California is the state which is really on the forefront of climate adaptation planning in the United States. Punta Gorda is a part of the southwestern Florida climate change compact. Again, it's at the regional scale, not on the state scale in this case, but at the regional scale. Lots of other initiatives are happening. The same in France. We saw both in case of Nancy and in case of Saint-Étienne, lots of initiatives happening at the broader scale around those cities. We also found that these cities and all other cities in our sample face 5 major challenges when it comes to climate adaptation planning. Essentially, all these plans, so the majority of plans, showed significant lack of continuity. It's not really clear from reading of these plans what is going to happen next and how this work is going to continue. We also found, unfortunately, a lack of collaboration among the cities. Even if there are some really excellent plans, we don't see the evidence that cities are working together. We don't see yet the evidence that there's enough of collaboration. That's why the database, like the one that we are compiling from this study, is very important, because we hope that it's going to be this sharing toolkit and sharing database and knowledge base for the cities, that they can continue populating with new climate adaptation plans and sharing with each other. We also found insufficient diversity and collaboration of stakeholders in the majority of cases, and this is something that needs to be addressed both in France and the United States, and probably in many other countries. We also found insufficient integration across economic sector, scale, and planning initiatives. As it comes to climate adaptation plans, the majority of these plans are really written as standalone documents without clear vision of how they can be integrated with other planning measures. And finally, the last but not the least, we found really rampant lack of attention to social and economic aspects of human vulnerability, and lack of attention to environmental equity and justice. And this is very troubling, because the purpose of climate adaptation plans is to protect everyone, and especially to protect the most vulnerable populations. And we found very little evidence that these plans are really working to protect the most vulnerable. So here are our recommendations, and you would also find more information on our recommendation if you read the article in Urban Climate. So our first group of recommendation is focusing on multi-scale and sector integration. Plans need to be written in such a way that they would really address conscious integration of climate adaptation planning in urban and regional planning. We also hope to see better integration of climate change adaptation with mitigation and emergency preparedness planning. The second group of recommendation is focusing on financial and human resources. We recommend that cities and states and the federal government focus on allocation of dedicated paid personnel with adequate training in the local governments. Right now, there is a shortage of experts in climate adaptation planning. Very few universities even offer a degree in climate adaptation planning. Very few people are available to write those climate adaptation plans, and cities very often don't have enough of resources. So we also recommend allocation of dedicated budget for climate adaptation planning to follow-up assessment. Cities need dedicated budget, and cities need dedicated personnel in order to do this kind of work. Very often it's performed ad hoc, and there is not enough of qualified personnel. And this is true both in France and in the United States. The third group of recommendation is focusing on participation and inclusion. We recommend creation of more avenues for community and industry engagement in climate adaptation planning process, as climate preparedness is an important task for the entire community. Many plans are written by very small climate task force, and sometimes it's not clear how the citizens, how the neighborhood associations, how various environmental groups, how local businesses, local environmental organizations, academia, and so on and so forth, how all these partners can make sure that their voice is really heard and integrated, and how they can make meaningful contribution into development of climate adaptation plan of their city. We also recommend implementation of policies promoting integration of climate change mitigation and adaptation planning in schools, colleges, universities, public and private institutions in a similar way how we integrate today emergency planning. And again, at this time of coronavirus pandemic, it's really hard to underemphasize the importance of integrated emergency planning. We all are experiencing it right now, like in the United States and in France and everywhere around the world. We understand right now, living this experience, how emergency planning is essential for our everyday life. And so we really need to treat climate adaptation planning in the same way, because the consequences of climate change can be sometimes unexpected and unpredictable, and they can come to us just as quickly as what we're experiencing right now with this pandemic. So the level of preparedness and the level of integration is really paramount. And we also recommend implementation of new ways of participation of citizen science. We recommend engagement of citizens for data collection, for collaboration with academic institutions, and integrating more local data into vulnerability assessment and development of climate change scenarios for the cities through those collaborative measures. The fourth group of recommendation is focusing on coordination and networking. We recommend facilitation of international, national, and subnational dialogues and collaboration on climate adaptation planning quality assessment. So today, this type of dialogue is pretty well established when it comes to climate mitigation planning. Have been lots of progress achieved nationally and internationally when it comes to cutting emissions of greenhouse gases. We really need to achieve the same progress of international collaboration and national collaboration when it comes to climate adaptation planning. We also recommend more coordination among the existing international networks such as ICLEI, C40s, Cities Climate Leadership, 100 Resilient Cities, Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, and other organizations. They all have done tremendous contributions into the methodologies of climate adaptation planning, but there have been not enough of integrations, and very often city governments, local governments can be sometimes overwhelmed by a variety of different guidelines coming at different scales, and yet there is no kind of streamlined flow of information. So we need to see more collaboration and more coordination among those different networks, and also streamlining of different methodologies and different toolkits that are available for the local governments. The third recommendation in this group is more coordination among the local governments at the subnational and state and regional level. This is especially true for the United States because we don't have right now national or even state, many states don't have state methodology, so different cities use very different methodological approaches, and the adaptation plans are really not comparable. They're very difficult to compare. In France, the situation is different because the ADMA, the equivalent of the US EPA, does have a methodology that all cities use, and so these data are more comparable and it really facilitates learning of cities from successes of each other. So clearly, the US as a whole and different states need to adopt similar approach, and we see similar approach in some states, such as for example California, when there are lots of resources have been put in climate adaptation planning. We see a number of states that adopt similar measures, but we also see some other states in the United States where really not much has been done so far on climate adaptation at all. We also recommend convening a regular major international conference on urban climate adaptation planning to bring together urban planners and climate scientists and industry educators, nonprofit organizations, really different groups of stakeholders for conversations about how cities can improve their climate adaptation plans and how all these different groups of stakeholders can participate and support their own communities around the world. The fifth group of recommendation is focusing on research and educational issues related to climate adaptation planning. So here we recommend development of climate services in order to produce climate data relevant for communities at the scale, relevant for cities, relevant for counties, and understandable for people who are writing those climate adaptation plans. So some of these toolkits and data already exist. Again, I want to mention the example of California. CalAdapt is an online platform with lots of data and lots of climate information and climate change scenarios that can be easily used by Californian cities using streamlined methodologies for developing climate adaptation plans that are relevant for those communities. These kind of climate services need to be available in all countries and in all states. We also recommend harmonization of quality assessment across the geographic scales and economic sectors, conscious integration of social and environmental justice consideration in assessment of human vulnerability and adaptation planning. This is where we see a very major challenge and shortcoming in the majority of existing climate adaptation plan. We are working on our next study is focusing specifically on the assessment of social justice in climate adaptation planning and the way how consideration of social justice is linked to understanding of human vulnerability and how it is linked in turn to diversity of stakeholders that are engaged in climate adaptation planning. And clearly much more research is needed in this area, and more action is necessary. Cities need to work with diverse stakeholders in order to achieve a higher level of environmental justice and better measures to protect their vulnerable populations. And finally, we also recommend integration of climate adaptation planning in the higher education curriculum and K-12 curriculum because climate adaptation preparedness is just as important as emergency planning. So it needs to be a part of our education. Everybody needs to be educated about how to adapt to the impacts of climate change, because it can be a question of life and death. It can be a question that is just as important for our resiliency as in the context of the pandemic where we are right now. So everybody needs to be educated about what they should do if their community is exposed to climate-related emergencies. Well, thank you. I would open up to the questions on the Blackboard tonight at 6 o'clock. So you can either email me your questions. You will have a live session for questions and answers at 6 o'clock on the Blackboard. And again, you can use your microphones, or you can send me the questions through the chat. And this recording would be available on the Blackboard through the end of the semester. And of course, you also have the PowerPoint without narration, and you also have my our article as well. Well, have a wonderful day, and I will see you on class on Blackboard Collaborate.